Hey guys, tonight we step quietly into a story that looks, from a distance, like the peaceful closing of a queen's life. But when you get close enough to see the way the candlelight trembles across her abandoned bed, you'll realize you're about to enter one of the loneliest deaths in royal history. And honestly, you won't survive this one if you still imagine queens always die surrounded by velvet and devotion. Picture this with me in the present tense, a grand palace that once pulsed with footsteps and trumpets now sits hollow like a ribcage, its long corridors breathing cold November air, the windows fog from the slow collapse of a dying fire. And in the center of it lies Mary, the daughter of a king and queen, her body failing, her mind flickering, and her entire court quietly slipping away from her like ghosts abandoning a house before it falls. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while we start this journey, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. Because tonight we're crossing the boundary between a world that celebrates queens and a world that forgets them in their final hour. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Mary Tudor, the first queen to rule England in her own right, died on a cold morning in the 11th month of the year 1558, but the tragedy of her death began long before her final breath. Imagine her in those last days, a woman barely 42 years old, but carrying the weight of a body twice that age, trapped inside a mattress that had grown stiff with neglect, her skin fading to the color of old parchment, her heartbeat struggling like a bird inside a closing hand. She had once commanded armies, passed laws, bent the will of the realm, but now she lay in silence, listening to the distant echo of footsteps that no longer came to her chamber door. The truth is that queens rarely die suddenly. They fade, slowly, painfully, and often invisibly. And Mary faded more completely than most, swallowed by sickness, heartbreak, and a kingdom that no longer believed in her. The air inside her bedchamber had grown dense and heavy in those final weeks, thick with the sour scent of fever and the metallic tang of despair. Curtains that once framed her as a symbol of royal magnificence now hung motionless, like worn-out shrouds waiting for purpose. Mary's attendants, once numerous enough to fill the room with chatter, had dwindled day by day as the political tides shifted in favor of her half-sister Elizabeth. By the time Mary entered her last stretch of illness, only a handful of loyal women remained, moving quietly, their shadows flickering on the walls, as though the room itself were breathing more urgently than the queen had held. Each evening the candles burned shorter, and each dawn Mary awoke wondering if the world outside her fogged windows still knew she existed. Her illness had begun subtly in the late months of the year, 1557, with pains in her abdomen and a heaviness that settled over her body like a dark cloak she could not remove. At first she thought it was another pregnancy, a final chance to give England the heir she had promised for so many years. She had experienced such illusions before twice, in fact, phantom swellings and phantom kicks that convinced even the court physicians that a child was on its way. But this time the swelling grew stranger, sharper, and the dull ache in her belly crept outward until it seemed to pull at her organs like a tightening rope. The physicians muttered to themselves behind thick oak doors, scribbling diagnoses in ink that would dissolve into obscurity centuries later. But the truth was simple. Mary was dying, and no one knew how to save her. Outside her room, England suffered with her. A brutal influenza swept through the land, killing thousands in London alone. The winds carried the scent of smoke and sickness. Markets closed, and families buried their dead in shallow graves as the cold tightened its grip on the realm. It felt, to many, as though the kingdom itself were exhaling its last alongside its queen. Mary's counselors slipped away one by one, claiming urgent business or attending to the needs of the state. But the truth was colder. They no longer wished to be associated with a monarch who clearly would not survive. Power was already bending toward Elizabeth, and the court, ever sensitive to shifts in the wind, followed the breeze. Inside the room, Mary's world shrank until it consisted only of the space between her sheets and the flicker of candlelight. She no longer recognized faces, no longer saw the colors of the world, for darkness had crept into her vision, leaving only faint outlines. Her mind drifted between clarity and hallucination, and she whispered for people who had died decades earlier, her mother, Catherine of Aragon, the ladies of her childhood, even servants lost to time. Sometimes she called for her husband, Philip, the man she adored more fiercely than he ever adored her. He was hundreds of miles away, uninterested in returning, but Mary still reached for him with trembling hands, believing that love could anchor her to life. Her attendants lied gently, telling her he was on his way, that he would arrive in days, that he sent prayers. In truth, his silence was as complete as her loneliness. The strangest moments came in the final week. When the veil between worlds thinned and Mary began to speak of visions, children dancing near the edge of her bed, radiant forms suspended in the air, voices singing softly in a language no one else could hear. Whether these were angels, fevered dreams, or memories resurfacing from childhood, no one could say. What mattered was the peace they gave her in the moments when pain allowed her no rest. She spoke to them as if they were real. She reached out to them as though they might lift her from the weight of her failing body. And as the 11th day of the 11th month approached, Mary drifted further from the realm of the living. On the morning of her death, the few attendants who remained had grown so accustomed to the slow rhythm of her breathing that they did not immediately notice when it stopped. She lay still, her face softened by the dim light, her fingers curled loosely on the coverlet as if she had simply drifted into deeper sleep. Minutes passed before one of the women realized the silence in the room had changed, the air too still, the queen too quiet. When they touched her, she was already gone. No trumpets, no royal vigil, no procession of grieving nobles. Just a quiet exhale swallowed by a hollow palace. A Queen of England died, and for a moment, no one knew. The story settles now into the dim chamber Mary left behind, a space still warm with the fading imprint of her body, as if her spirit hesitated before departing entirely. Outside, the world continued its slow November crawl, the cold pushing beneath doors, the fog clinging to the river. But inside the palace, something heavier gathered in the corners, the quiet shock of realizing that the queen was not merely sleeping. Her attendants, trembling, uncertain, hovered around the bed, their breaths held as though exhaling too loudly might disturb the solemn stillness. They did not cry at first. Grief is rarely immediate. It arrives in fragments, first disbelief, then understanding, then the heavy knowledge that no one was coming to reclaim the moment and make it less final. Mary had been slipping away for months, but the court had trained itself to pretend otherwise. Even now, with her body cooling beneath the thin blankets, the women who stood beside her struggled to accept that the long fight was over. Her last breaths had been so faint that they seemed like a whisper rather than a departure. And the fading rise and fall of her chest had given the illusion of life long enough for doubt to take root. One attendant reached for Mary's wrist, touching the spot where a pulse should have been. Another leaned close to listen for any hint of breath. Nothing. The silence deepened until it felt like a physical presence in the room, pressing softly against the walls. Word traveled hesitantly at first, drifting from one servant to another, then carried down the corridor by those who understood the urgency of what Mary's death meant. It was not only the end of a life, but the immediate shift of power. Even before formal announcements, even before the council assembled, the palace began to realign itself like a great machine adjusting to a new operator. Servants bowed their heads, courtiers exchanged glances, and somewhere in the palace's vast network of rooms, a group of officials began preparing to ride for Hatfield, where Elizabeth, Mary's half-sister, waited with careful patience. But before the wheels of politics spun fully into motion, there was the matter of the Queen's body, the fragile, failing vessel that had carried Mary through years of illness, heartbreak, and disappointment. In the dimness of that chamber, her features softened into a kind of peace she had not known in life. the lines etched by suffering smoothed slightly. Her eyes, long clouded by illness, remained closed. Her lips, once pressed tightly in determination or pain, relaxed. Death had released her from the symptoms that had chained her since childhood. Yet even in death, her loneliness lingered. No crowds gathered. No king wept beside her. No family held her hand. Her attendants stood quietly, aware that history often forgets who remains faithful in the final hours of a monarch's life. They moved slowly now, their gestures deliberate, gathering linens, straightening the bedclothes, whispering prayers. The windows were drawn shut to keep out the harsh November air, leaving the room dim except for a single candle that flickered in the draught that seeped through cracks in the stone. One woman wiped Mary's forehead with a cloth, more out of habit than necessity. Another adjusted the blanket to cover her shoulders. These small acts of tenderness were all they could offer. Gestures meant not for the queen she had been, but for the suffering woman they had watched fade day by day. While they worked, memories of Mary's final weeks flickered in their minds. Moments they had never spoken aloud but carried in silence. The early signs of decline in the late months of the year, 1557, when she began to speak less, breathe harder, and move with the stiffness of someone perpetually bracing for pain. The way her abdomen had swelled again, reviving old fears and old hopes that this time, perhaps, a child might truly come. The way she asked repeatedly for her husband Philip, longing for comfort he never sent, comfort he had never truly given, even when he stood at her side. And the way she whispered prayers in the dark when she thought no one could hear, prayers for a kingdom she worried she had failed, for a child she never had, for a life that had never unfolded the way she imagined when she was young. Outside, the palace was stirring. Heavy footsteps moved through the corridors as officials approached the Queen's chamber with an urgency sharpened by political necessity. They needed to verify the death, secure the body, and send word to Elizabeth. Every delay carried risk. Every moment mattered. Yet when they entered the room, even they paused at the sight of Mary's stillness, the quiet arrangement of her hands, the faint trace of suffering that lingered around her features. For all the decisions they had made during her reign, for all the debates, disagreements, and disappointments, this was the moment that reduced everything to a single truth: the Queen was gone. The officials murmured to one another, examining the body briefly, not cruelly but clinically, their gazes flicking from Mary to one another as if seeking confirmation of what they already knew. A life had ended. A reign had ended. A chapter of England's story had closed. And yet none of them spoke her name with any sense of reverence. Duty overshadowed sentiment. They moved quickly to secure rings, documents, symbols of authority, objects that no longer belonged to Mary, but now belonged to her successor. As the officials exited to begin the transfer of power, the attendants remained behind for a moment longer, unwilling to leave her alone just yet. They touched her hand, kissed her forehead, or whispered farewells shaped by years of service and affection. Some of them had known her before she was queen, had seen her endure heartbreak after heartbreak, had watched her carry the wounds of childhood into adulthood without ever finding true solace. They knew, more than anyone, that Mary's harshest trials had been born in private long before the public ever judged her. Eventually, though, they too had to leave. The palace was shifting into a new rhythm, a new allegiance forming, a new world opening beyond Mary's deathbed. The candle beside the bed burned down to a puddle of wax. The cold deepened. The silence returned. And as the room emptied, the story of Mary Tudor's final days expanded beyond that dim chamber, gathering the threads of illness, abandonment, political collapse, and the quiet tragedy of a woman who had tried her whole life to be worthy of love she never fully received. The palace did not rest after Mary's death. It simply shifted, like a great beast rolling onto a new limb, its bones cracking quietly in the dark. While attendants whispered prayers over the cooling body of their queen, the machinery of the realm pivoted with ruthless efficiency toward Elizabeth, whose claim now rose like the sun over a horizon no one could ignore. Yet before coronations and proclamations, before jubilation or fear, there remained the strange, suspended hours in which Mary's life had ended, but her story had not yet closed. Those hours were heavy, suffocating, and filled with the quiet unraveling of the world she left behind. It is into that pause between death and legacy that we now drift, where the shadows lengthen and the truth of Mary's suffering fully comes into view. Her illness had never been a single sickness, but a lifetime of afflictions stacked one upon another. Beginning in her adolescence when violent cramps and hemorrhaging racked her body month after month. By the time she reached her late 30s, the damage was irreversible. The swelling in her abdomen during her final year, a swelling she initially mistook for a long-awaited pregnancy, was a cruel echo of her earlier false hopes. It grew steadily, tightening her skin, pushing upward into her ribs, making each breath a negotiation between willpower and pain. Physicians who attended her tried poultices, herbs, hot compresses, and whispered prayers, but Mary's body was collapsing from within. The likely culprit, though unknown at the time, was a malignant mass spreading through her womb and liver, a darkness expanding quietly beneath her royal garments. In the weeks leading to her final decline, the pain became less manageable. Mary would grip the bedposts until her knuckles whitened, curling forward as if trying to escape her own skin. Her attendants saw the tension in her jaw, the trembling in her fingers, the sheen of sweat gathering along her hairline, even in the cold of winter. She rarely slept. When she did, she slipped into uneasy dreams, muttering names of people long gone, her mother Catherine, her governess Lady Salisbury, even her younger brother Edward, whose memory pressed against her conscience like an old bruise. Every day, she drifted further from the world, her strength dissolving quietly into the linen sheets. Still, she tried to rule. She asked for reports about the influenza ravaging London, where thousands had already died. She listened to dispatches about rebellions, harvest failures, and the ceaseless political maneuvering among her counselors. But her voice grew softer, her instructions shorter, until finally the council met without her, their decisions made in rooms she no longer had the strength to enter. The kingdom, sensing the shift, began preparing itself not for recovery, but for transition. Philip's absence pressed on her like a stone. He had left England months earlier with little intention of returning, his heart tethered not to his wife, but to the political ambitions that had drawn him across Europe. Mary wrote letters that grew more desperate as her condition worsened, letters begging him to return, to stand by her in her suffering. No reply ever came. Even as she lay dying, she asked whether a messenger had arrived for her. Her attendants, unwilling to wound her further, told gentle lies that floated through the room like soft mist settling over a dying fire. The final week brought a strange clarity mixed with hallucination. One night she awoke abruptly, reaching toward the empty space beside her bed, insisting she saw a small child standing there with golden hair and a gentle smile. Another time she murmured to an unseen figure to gather the children of heaven and lead them forward. Her attendants exchanged worried glances but said nothing. They had seen enough death to recognize visions that emerge when the mind loosens its hold on the body. Whether these visitors were angels, memories, or the last flickers of consciousness, they seemed to bring her comfort. Her breathing eased in those moments, her expression softening, as though the world she longed for, one filled with innocence and purpose, was finally within reach. Outside her chamber, the palace was unraveling in its own way. Court members who had once pledged unwavering loyalty began packing their belongings discreetly, eager to reach Hatfield before others could stake their claims to Elizabeth's favor. Servants disappeared down corridors, some silently grieving, others calculating their next move in a world where allegiance could mean survival. The palace that had once boasted hundreds of residents now felt hollow, its long hallways echoing with the emptiness left behind. Even officials who had served Mary faithfully grew restless, whispering among themselves about Elizabeth's likely policies, her religious stance, her temperament, as though Mary's memory had already faded from the tapestries and portraits that bore her image. In these shifting hours, Mary's identity as a ruler dissolved rapidly. The woman who lay dying in her dark chamber was no longer the queen to whom they had bowed, but a figure slipping quietly into history. Her authority reduced to the frail rise and fall of her chest. The crown that had once weighed heavily on her head now seemed miles away, irrelevant to the reality of her suffering. She was simply Mary, daughter of a forsaken marriage, survivor of a childhood marked by political exile, a woman who had carried deep wounds into adulthood and was now paying the final price for a life lived at the mercy of others' ambitions. As her final day approached, those who remained by her side began preparing for a ritual they hoped would ease her crossing. They lit candles, read prayers, placed rosary beads in her weakening hands. And though Mary could no longer see clearly, she seemed to sense the nearness of the end. Her breast became shallow, her hands cold, her voice a thin thread stretched between two worlds. The attendants leaned close, hearing her whisper a final plea for forgiveness, for peace, for the child she never had, for a love that never returned. By the time the last candle burned low, she had already begun slipping into silence, her body relaxing as though finally released from decades of tension. But the tragedy of her final hours was not only that she died in pain, it was that she died unseen, unheard, unhonored by the kingdom she had fought so fiercely to guide. Her story was still unfolding, but now the place she once held in the world was empty, waiting to be filled by someone else. And as her attendants stood in the fading glow of candlelight, they realized the truth. No one wished to speak. Mary's life had been tragic, but her afterlife, twisted into legend, misunderstood by generations, would be even more so. The hours after Mary's death unfolded with an eerie mixture of urgency and stillness, as though the palace itself could not decide whether to mourn or move on. While the attendants whispered prayers and tried to keep the cold from settling too quickly into the queen's limbs, another process began to take shape beyond the quiet chamber, a process in which emotion had no place, a process built from protocol, fear, ambition, and the relentless forward march of a kingdom that could not pause simply because its monarch had breathed her last. And yet, in the midst of these shifting priorities, there was still Mary herself, lingering like a faint echo in the rooms where she had once ruled and suffered, her presence clinging to tapestries, to stone, to the memory of footsteps long gone. It is into this uneasy transition that we drift now, where the line between grief and abandonment blurs until neither can be fully separated from the other. The first strange sign of this transition arrived with the officials who came to confirm her death. They entered the darkened chamber, carrying not sorrow but duty, their expressions tightened by the knowledge that the future depended on the past being officially declared over. One approached the bed and lifted Mary's hand, cool and stiffening, noting the pale hue that had already begun to settle beneath her skin. Another leaned down to look for any sign of breath. A third glanced at her as though assessing an object rather than a person, cataloging the details he would need to report in the official record. The Queen's death to them was an event rather than a loss. Their voices remained hushed, but not out of reverence, more out of the instinctive caution that accompanies political transition. The removal of her coronation ring was the moment that etched itself most deeply into the memory of those few who saw it. One of the men grasped her hand and tugged at the ring that had symbolized her authority, the ring that had once bound her to the crown she wore with equal parts pride and anguish. Her fingers were slightly swollen from illness, and the official struggled for several moments, twisting and pulling until the metal finally slid free. The gesture felt jarringly intimate and brutally impersonal at the same time, as though her entire reign could be reduced to a piece of gold passed from one sovereign to the next. When the officials left to begin preparations for announcing Elizabeth's accession, the attendants were finally allowed a moment of stillness. They gathered near the window, its glass frosting with winter cold, and watched the sky fade from dawn to a pale, indifferent morning. Some whispered prayers for Mary's soul, while others simply stood in silence. Their expressions tightened with a mixture of sadness and exhaustion. They had watched her endure so much illness, betrayal, loneliness, political storms, and now they faced the strange emptiness of her absence, an emptiness that settled into the air like a slow descending fog. Outside the chamber, the palace began its ritual shedding of loyalties. Servants rushed to replace Mary's banners with Elizabeth's colors, moving through hallways that still smelled of fever and damp wool. Guards adjusted their posts, unsure whether their duties had changed. Courtiers who had spent years flattering Mary now avoided her name, as though even speaking it aloud might reveal misplaced allegiance. Some slipped quietly toward the stables, eager to ride to Hatfield and be among the first to swear loyalty to Elizabeth. Others stayed behind, either out of caution or because they understood that the tides of power required careful navigation, not reckless haste. Amid this political repositioning, Mary's body remained untouched except for the gentle rearranging of linen and the drawing of curtains to keep the cold from hastening decay. There was no royal vigil, no procession of clergy chanting solemn hymns. Her passing, while momentous, unfolded with an almost painful quietness. Those who had loved her few, but devoted tried to preserve some dignity in the way they prepared her for the rituals to come. But they were constrained by time, uncertainty, and the absence of clear instruction. Even in death, Mary's place in the kingdom seemed uncertain, as though her reign had ended with a whisper rather than a proclamation. As the morning lengthened, the attendants carried out small acts of remembrance, each gesture shaped by personal memory rather than royal protocol. One smoothed Mary's hair, brushing it gently away from her temples, remembering how the queen used to sit before the mirror and sigh softly when the aches in her body grew too difficult to hide. Another placed a rosary between her folded hands, recalling the countless nights Mary had prayed for guidance, forgiveness, or simply the strength to wake and face another day. These were not grand gestures, not the ceremonial honors granted to kings and conquerors. They were human gestures, quiet and tender, rooted in the genuine affection and pity that had grown from witnessing Mary's suffering firsthand. The palace outside remained in motion, but Mary's chamber felt frozen in time. The faint scent of rosewater lingered in the air, mixing with the sharper, metallic smell of sickness that had seeped into the bedding over months of decline. The wooden floor creaked softly when the attendants stepped across it, the sound almost startling in the otherwise heavy silence. Light filtered weakly through the curtains, casting long, thin shadows across the bed where Mary lay, her body already beginning to lose the warmth that had once animated her every gesture. Between these shadows and the stillness of the room, one truth emerged with heartbreaking clarity. Mary had lived a life defined by longing for her mother, for stability, for acceptance, for love, and in the end, she had died longing still. She had yearned for Philip's return until her final moments, her eyes lifting hopefully whenever the door opened, expecting news that never came. She had wished for a child, a living symbol of her legacy, and instead carried phantom pregnancies that mocked her hopes. She had fought to restore her mother's honor, only to be overshadowed by the reign of her radiant half-sister Elizabeth, who would soon be celebrated as England's golden ruler. In these lingering hours, Mary's attendants felt the weight of that longing settle into the room like a final breath. They did not speak of her failures or her reputation. They did not judge her decisions or the bloody aftermath that history would forever attach to her name. They saw instead the woman beneath the crown, the one who had suffered quietly, who had fought to belong, who had loved deeply and lost repeatedly, who had walked through a world that rarely gave her the tenderness she craved. And as they stood in the dim chamber, listening to the palace adjust to its new queen, they understood something that history often forgets. Mary Tudor had not been monstrous. She had been wounded. She had been weary. She had been human. In the silence that followed, the story of her final days continued its slow unfolding, not through proclamations or formal records, but through the quiet memories of those who had watched her fade, and the quiet truth that even queens die alone, longing for the one thing that power can never guarantee: love that stays. The hours continued to drift forward in a hush that felt unnatural for a royal residence, as though the palace itself were holding its breath while the world outside began rearranging itself around a new sovereign. Yet inside the chamber where Mary's body lay, time behaved differently, stretching, folding, lingering in corners like a reluctant guest who did not yet understand it was time to leave. Her attendants moved slowly, afraid to disturb the fragile stillness settling into the bedclothes, the curtains, the stone beneath their feet. They sensed, though none dared to speak it aloud, that the palace was beginning to forget Mary even before she was carried from her room, and that forgetting the quiet erasure that begins the moment a ruler's heart stops was perhaps the cruelest part of her passing. Outside the chamber, the corridors came alive with a muted frenzy. Messengers hurried past tapestries without sparing them a glance, their boots striking the floors with a rhythm shaped not by mourning, but by necessity. They were on their way to Hatfield, carrying hastily prepared documents that would inform Elizabeth that she was now queen. The shift was immediate. The kingdom could not afford hesitation. But the quickness with which her attendants and officials pivoted from Mary to Elizabeth left the palace with an atmosphere of unease, as though something sacred had been rushed, interrupted, or simply overlooked. Inside the chamber, Mary's attendants felt that unease pressing against their ribs as they prepared her body for the washing rituals. It was a solemn task, one they had performed for nobles before, but never for a queen who had suffered so visibly and so quietly. They lifted her gently from the bed, surprised by how light she felt, as though she were already partway gone, carried off by the weight of her pain long before death finished its work. Her abdomen, once swollen and taut with illness, now softened beneath their touch, the rigidity easing as her body surrendered to stillness. They washed her with water warmed over a small brazier and scented faintly with lavender, an attempt to mask the lingering odor of sickness that had clung to her for months. Her skin, once flushed with fever, now looked pale and almost translucent under the dim light. As they worked, the attendants recalled the countless nights spent kneeling beside her, holding her hand while she struggled through waves of abdominal pain that left her curled inward like a wounded animal. They remembered how she whispered for her mother, how she prayed aloud when she thought she was alone, how tears sometimes slipped silently from beneath her lashes when she believed no one could see. These memories arrived with a bittersweet clarity, filling the room with a tenderness that the rest of the palace had long since abandoned. Outside the door, the political world, sharp, impatient, unforgiving, continued its rapid reorganization. Servants carried away tapestries bearing Mary's emblems, replacing them with blank spaces that would soon display Elizabeth's insignia. Even the music of the palace shifted. Where Mary's reign had been marked by heavy, somber tones that mirrored her sorrowful nature, Elizabeth's supporters whispered of brighter melodies, of renewal, of youth and promise. These whispers drifted into the chamber like cold wind, causing one attendant to close the door firmly, as though protecting Mary from the sound of her own obsolescence. While they tended to her, Mary's body gave up the last of its warmth. Her hands stiffened slightly, her fingers curling inward as though grasping something that had never been offered to her in life. The rosary beads placed between her palms felt heavy against her cooling skin. One of the attendants paused to press a kiss to Mary's forehead, a quiet gesture of devotion from a woman who had witnessed firsthand the vulnerabilities that history would later obscure. Mary, she knew, had suffered from illnesses that medicine could not name, borne the weight of political pressures that no heart could endure without cracking, and endured a loneliness that no queen should ever be left to face. She had not been perfect, no monarch was, but she had carried the sorrow of her lineage with a dignity that deserved more than whispers and quick erasure. The hours passed. Outside, the sky brightened into an anemic winter daylight. The first official announcement of Mary's death was made from the steps of the palace chapel, where a priest murmured the news to a small assembly of courtiers whose expressions remained fixed, their thoughts already turning to Elizabeth. Those who had once pledged loyalty to Mary bowed their heads for a moment, long enough to be seen, then dispersed, vanishing down the stone steps like shadows dissolving into sunlight. Back in the chamber, the attendants prepared Mary's body for embalming. They knew, though it pained them, that this next stage required the presence of surgeons who had no connection to the queen beyond their obligation to preserve her remains. They worked with brisk efficiency, their hands steady, their voices low, and while they opened her abdomen to remove the organs that would decay most quickly. One attendant, a woman who had served Mary since her teens, turned away, unable to reconcile the brutality of the process with the gentleness of the woman she had known. She had heard the surgeons murmur among themselves the tumors, the swelling, the signs of deep internal decay that had spread through Mary's womb and liver. These revelations confirmed the suffering Mary had endured for decades. No phantom ailments, no imagined pains, no dramatic exaggerations. She had been dying from within long before the kingdom ever saw her falter. When the embalming was finished, the attendants wrapped Mary in layers of linen, smoothing each fold with care, closing her eyes with gentle fingertips, arranging her dark hair so that it framed her face without revealing the gauntness illness had carved into her features. They dressed her in a simple gown of black velvet, not the elaborate finery reserved for a monarch lying in state, for the palace had not yet decided how much pageantry Mary deserved, and so the attendants, acting from love rather than protocol, gave her what dignity they could. By late afternoon, Mary's chamber fell quiet again. The attendants stepped back, their work complete, though their hearts felt unsettled. They glanced at one another, sensing the unspoken truth hanging in the air. Mary's legacy would not be shaped by those who knew her suffering. It would be shaped by those eager to define her through the lens of politics, religion, and fear. And so Mary Tudor, daughter of a king, child of a broken marriage, queen of a divided nation, lay in silence, unaware that the story now rolling forward outside her chamber would cast her not as a woman who fought through unrelenting pain, but as a legend of darkness whose humanity would be swallowed by the name history chose for her, a name she never heard in life, a name she never deserved. The winter light faded early that evening, slipping down the palace walls like a slow-moving shadow that seemed intent on swallowing the last trace of warmth from Mary's chamber. Outside, the corridors hummed with the low, urgent movements of a household already adjusting itself to a future without her. But inside the room where her body rested, the air remained still, almost reverent, as though time itself refused to intrude any further. The attendants lingered a moment longer, reluctant to abandon her to the cold formality of the embalmers and guards, reluctant to let the door close on the woman they had cared for through illness, fear, loneliness, and betrayal. When they finally stepped out, each carrying the heaviness of a farewell they were not permitted to voice aloud, the palace seemed to exhale a long, weary breath, releasing everything she had once held together by sheer force of will. And then came the silence. It settled over her rooms with a kind of finality that felt almost sentient, creeping into the tapestries, pooling in the corners, turning even the echo of footsteps into something ghostly. For the first time in decades, Mary Tudor had no one left to answer to, no counsel demanding decisions, no husband sending cold letters from across the sea, no court watching her every movement for signs of weakness. And yet, in this strange freedom, she was also more alone than she had ever been in life. The palace around her continued to shift gears, its machinery turning toward Elizabeth, its officials forging new alliances, its servants whispering about the changes to come. But no one paused long enough to wonder what remained of Mary the person, not the queen now that her suffering had ended. Across the palace courtyard, in a dimly lit council chamber, the first formal discussions of the succession took place. The men assembled there spoke Mary's name only as a reference point, a closed chapter, a conclusion necessary for the next story to begin. They talked quietly about sending riders to Hatfield, about securing the treasury, about managing public reaction to the transition. They discussed the need for religious clarity under Elizabeth, the likely reversal of Mary's policies, the careful choreography required to prevent unrest. But none of them mentioned Mary's bravery during the uprisings of her youth, or the steadfastness she showed during her struggle for legitimacy, or the childhood wounds that shaped her entire being. They spoke of reigns, not lives, policies, not pain. Meanwhile, the embalmers completed their work and sealed Mary's body in layers of linen and pitch, their movements efficient, practiced, devoid of sentiment. To them, she was not a monarch who had lived with chronic illness since adolescence, whose womb had betrayed her hopes over and over, whose life had been a battlefield between private suffering and public duty. She was simply another body to be prepared, another link in a long chain of royal remains. When they placed her within the wooden shell that would hold her until the official coffin was ready, they murmured only the necessary words, nothing more. The warmth that had once radiated from her presence, the warmth her attendants had seen in quiet moments, had vanished, and beyond the chamber's heavy doors, a different form of quiet suffering unfolded. Many of the servants who had tended to Mary for years found themselves suddenly directionless. Those who had brushed her hair, retrieved her letters, arranged her meals, brought her comfort during her bouts of illness. These women and men were now dismissed from their duties with the same swiftness that had overtaken the palace after her death. Some would be reassigned to Elizabeth's household. Others would be quietly released, their service forgotten as seamlessly as Mary's reign was now being folded away. One young attendant, barely older than Mary herself had been when her mother was exiled, lingered at the far end of the corridor, her hands trembling as she realized she would never again hear Mary's soft voice asking for water, never again feel the Queen's fingers grip hers when pain surged through her abdomen. She had felt needed in those moments, even valued. Now she felt weightless, unnecessary, adrift in a world turning too quickly for her to follow. Further down the hall, two older servants whispered to one another about the Queen's final coherent words, spoken just hours before the fever swallowed her completely. She had murmured something about regret for her people, regret for her lack of an heir, regret for the misery her policies caused. But she had also whispered a plea for mercy from God, spoken not in fear but in a kind of weary acceptance. These servants had seen enough death to know when the body's ready to surrender and when the soul is ready to go. Mary, they felt, had lived too long in pain, physical, emotional, spiritual. Her passing might have been lonely, but perhaps it was also a release. Yet outside the palace walls, rumors began to spread as naturally as breath. Some said Mary had died in terror. Others claimed she had cursed Elizabeth with her final breath. And still others whispered that her corpse showed signs of divine judgment. The truth, simple, human, and unbearably sad, never traveled half as quickly as the myths did. People prefer stories that mirror their fears or confirm their beliefs, and Mary's life offered ample material for both. Already in taverns and markets, the moniker that would haunt her legacy, Bloody Mary, began to take shape, a name born not of compassion for her suffering, but of fear of her policies, a name that flattened her humanity into a symbol. Inside her chamber, still dim, still scented with lavender and death, Mary remained untouched by the noise of the outside world. The attendants had stepped away, the embalmers had finished, the officials had gone, and for a few hours, strange, suspended hours, she existed in a pocket of stillness that held neither honor nor condemnation. Only quiet. Only the soft layering of shadows on the sheets where her body rested. But even this fragile pause would not last. Soon the bells would toll. Soon the court would assemble. Soon Elizabeth would rise. And Mary, once a child torn from her mother, once a princess denied her birthright, once a queen who fought to reclaim dignity, would begin her long descent into legend. One where the truth of her suffering would be buried beneath the stories others preferred to tell. Her body lay still, but her story, as history would soon prove, was only just beginning to be rewritten. Through the long night that followed, the palace seemed to shift into a strange, in-between state, no longer the domain of the queen who had just died, yet not fully claimed by the sister who would soon take her place. It was as if the walls themselves were listening, waiting for the next command, the next ritual, the next proclamation. And in that hollow pause, while servants moved quietly and officials drafted urgent messages by trembling candlelight, something else stirred the first hints of ceremony, of final rites, of the ancient pattern through which monarchs are escorted from life into memory. Mary's body, wrapped and sealed, lay in a cold chamber near the privy garden, but her presence what remained of her grief, her longing, her faith seemed to drift through the palace corridors like a faint warmth that could not decide whether to linger or fade. Before dawn, a small procession of clerics entered the chamber where she rested. Their robes brushed softly against the stone floor, the sound almost swallowed by the thick silence that had settled over the room. They brought candles, their flames shivering in the draught, and placed them at the corners of the bier, transforming the darkness into something gentler but more solemn. One priest stepped forward to chant the first lines of the Office of the Dead, his voice low and resonant, echoing faintly against the walls. He had never been close to Mary in life. Few clerics had. Yet as he looked down at her, he felt a pull of sympathy and understanding. Perhaps that beneath the politics and the polarizing reputation, she had been a woman of sincere devotion, someone who clung fiercely to the faith that had shaped her since childhood. His chant flowed like a river through the stillness, touching the linen that wrapped her body, the cold surface of the table beneath her, the fading outlines of the room where she had spent her last days. Outside, the sky was beginning to pale, but the palace remained dim, its windows reflecting nothing but the faintest traces of dawn. A few attendants slipped quietly into the chamber as the priest prayed, hoping to witness the beginnings of the rituals that would honor the queen they had served. But their expressions tightened when they realized how few people had gathered for this first moment of farewell. They had expected more clergy, more courtiers, more signs of reverence. Instead, the room felt like a private vigil rather than a royal one, an intimate farewell to a woman who had spent so much of her reign feeling isolated. One of the younger attendants placed a small, embroidered pillow beneath Mary's head, smoothing the linen so it would not crease harshly around her features. She had sewn that pillow herself during Mary's earlier months of illness, stitching small crosses into the velvet with the quiet hope that the queen might find comfort in it. Now she pressed her fingertips against the fabric, feeling the softness beneath her touch, and whispered a prayer through tightly sealed lips. She wished Mary could have known, in her final hours, that there were hearts in the palace who had loved her not for her crown, not for her power, but for the fragile humanity she carried beneath the weight of both. In the hours that followed, more officials arrived not to grieve, but to measure, to plan, to decide. They needed to determine how Mary's funeral would be staged, how her body would be transported, how the rituals should unfold in a kingdom bracing for religious shift. The tension was palpable. Some wished to honor Mary with full Catholic rites. Others argued that such displays might offend Elizabeth, whose Protestant leanings were already well known. They debated quietly, sometimes harshly, as though Mary herself were not lying just a few feet away, her body growing colder as they spoke. In life, she had fought to reclaim her faith's place in England. In death, even her funeral became a battlefield for others' convictions. Yet amid these debates, something remarkable occurred. As the morning light strengthened, filtering through a narrow window high above the chamber, it fell directly onto Mary's wrapped form, illuminating her in soft, muted gold. The priests paused, their voices growing still. The attendants froze, their breaths caught. For a brief moment, just a heartbeat. Perhaps less, it felt as though the sun itself had leaned down to touch her, to grant her a grace she had seldom been given in life. The light warmed the linen, brightened the shadows, softened the air, and then it faded, slipping away as clouds drifted across the sky. By midday, preparations intensified. Carpenters brought in boards for the outer coffin. Heralds drafted proclamations. Courtiers discussed how long the queen's body should lie in state and whether her funeral procession should mirror that of her mother Catherine, a comparison that felt both fitting and heartbreaking. Mary had adored her mother, defended her legacy, and shaped her entire reign around restoring her honor. And now, in the echoes of these discussions, the shadow of Catherine seemed to fall once more across her daughter's fate. But not everyone thought of ceremony and politics. In another corner of the palace, an elderly woman who had once served Catherine of Aragon sat alone near a window overlooking the frost-covered courtyard. She had seen Mary as an infant, had watched her cling to her mother during the years of exile, had witnessed the tears Mary shed when Henry tore Catherine from their lives. Now she pressed a handkerchief to her face and wept not for the queen Mary had become, but for the child she had once been, the little girl with auburn hair who had asked whether her mother would return soon, the child who had clung to hope long after hope had ceased to exist. In that moment, Mary's death felt like the final closing of a wound that had been opened decades earlier, a wound that had shaped the girl long before she ever wore a crown. As dusk approached, the palace shifted again. Bells rang softly from the chapel. Clerics gathered for another round of prayers. The corridors filled with a melancholy murmur, the kind that sweeps through old buildings when history is turning its page. And though the world outside was already embracing Elizabeth as the new dawn of England, within this small chamber, another story lingered, the story of a queen whose final hours revealed not tyranny or cruelty, but an aching loneliness that history would later drown beneath a name she never earned. The priests finished their prayers for the evening, their voices fading into the stone like shadows dissolving at twilight. Mary remained silent, wrapped, sealed, and waiting for the procession that would take her to Westminster, waiting for the judgment of history, waiting for the peace that had eluded her in life. And as the candles burned low, one truth hovered in the dim air for all the power she once held, for all the decisions that carved her legacy. Mary Tudor's final journey would be shaped not by grandeur, but by the quiet grief of those few who had seen the woman beneath the crown and who knew how deeply she had suffered long before death finally claimed her. The night deepened over the palace with a heaviness that felt almost physical, pressing against windows, sinking into the stone floors, slowing every movement inside those ancient walls. And yet, even under the weight of darkness, preparations for Mary's final journey continued with a relentlessness that made the hours blur together. Servants carrying torches drifted through the corridors like wandering stars, their footsteps muffled by rush mats, their faces drawn and pale. The scent of wax, cold air, and faint lavender clung to everything. And in the center of this somber tide, Mary's chamber remained a world unto itself, quiet, shadowed, suspended, holding what little of her remained before she was taken away forever. The carpenters had finished the wooden shell that would encase her embalmed body, a simple construction that bore none of the grand ornamentation reserved for kings who died beloved and triumphant. It was lined with dark fabric, practical rather than glorious, its purpose more preservation than honor. A final coffin, one adorned with velvet and embroidered emblems, would come later. But this first container, this plain cradle of wood, was where Mary would begin her last procession. The attendants watched as the embalmers placed her inside, their movements careful but efficient, their silence broken only by the soft scrape of linen settling and the faint groan of wood adjusting to weight. When the lid was lowered slowly, solemnly, with a dull thud that seemed to echo far longer than it should, one attendant instinctively reached out, her fingertips brushing the edge as though she could anchor something that was slipping away too quickly. Another whispered a prayer under her breath, the words trembling in the cold air. They all knew this moment marked a final separation. As long as Mary lay in her bed, beneath the curtains that had framed her suffering, she remained the queen they had known. But inside the coffin, she became something else, an object of ritual, of ceremony, of history, a body to be displayed, a figure to be judged, a symbol stripped of breath. By morning, the palace stirred again, this time with the precise choreography that accompanies royal funerals. Officers of arms marched through the corridors, inspecting banners and funeral standards that had been hastily repainted during the night. Seamstresses mended black robes. Clerics gathered near the chapel, their faces pale in the torchlight, preparing the long series of offices and requiems that would accompany the queen's lying in state. The sound of muffled orders rose and fell through the palace, blending with the clatter of boots and the rustle of mourning fabric. But amid the order and ceremony, There was still a quiet undercurrent of unease, one born not from Mary's death, but from the shifting religious winds that her passing unleashed. The Catholic rites she had restored with such fervor were now fragile, endangered, waiting for Elizabeth's breath to decide whether they would continue or vanish in an instant. Some priests whispered prayers with trembling voices, fearful their presence would soon be unwelcome. Others performed their duties with a defiance Mary might have admired, determined to give her the farewell she would have wished for regardless of what came next. When the time arrived to move her body from the chamber, the attendants who had cared for her through every stage of her decline gathered around the bier. A group of guards lifted the coffin, their muscles tightening beneath the weight not heavy in mass, but heavy in meaning. As the coffin rose, a gust of cold air passed through the open door, brushing against the attendants' sleeves and raising goosebumps along their arms. It felt like a final sigh escaping the room, a whisper of release from the suffering Mary had endured within those walls. The procession moved slowly through the corridor, the guards stepping carefully, the priests chanting softly, the attendants trailing behind with lowered heads. Light flickered from torches lining the route, casting wavering shadows across the walls, shadows that seemed to follow Mary as she made her way toward the great hall where her body would lie in state. In life, she had walked these corridors with a stiff, deliberate gait, controlled by pain but determined in purpose. Now she traveled them without effort, carried by others, her struggles finally silenced. When they reached the great hall, the transformation was startling. Overnight, the servants had draped the space with black cloth, covering pillars, balconies, and even portions of the ceiling. A raised platform had been prepared in the center, adorned with candles whose flames trembled in the cold drafts that seeped into the hall despite its massive size. As the coffin was placed upon the platform, the attendants stepped back, watching the shape of Mary's final resting place emerge from the interplay of candlelight and shadow. She looked both grand and diminished grand because this was, after all, the hall of a queen, and diminished because so few people had come to witness her arrival. The first prayers of the lying in state began, echoing across the hall with a solemnity that felt almost fragile. The priests' voices rose in rhythmic waves, Latin syllables drifting up to the rafters like smoke. Their chants spoke of mercy, of rest, of passage into the eternal. They asked God to receive Mary's soul, to forgive her sins, to grant her peace. And as the words circled through the cavernous space, the attendants felt a strange and unexpected quiet ease settle over them, an understanding. Perhaps that whatever Mary had endured in life, this moment allowed her at last to step beyond the reach of pain. But the hall remained sparsely filled. Many courtiers who would once have crowded the space with eager displays of mourning had chosen instead to ride toward Hatfield, hoping to present themselves to Elizabeth before others arrived. Loyalty, in the Tudor world, was too often measured by opportunity rather than emotion. And so Mary lay in a hall that should have resounded with lamentation, surrounded instead by flickering candles, a handful of clergy, and the few loyal attendants who refused to abandon her. The hush inside the hall felt almost sacred, as though it wrapped Mary in a blanket of quiet dignity she had been denied in life. The candles reflected off the polished wood of the coffin, casting a faint golden glow across its surface, soft, warm, like the light that had touched her earlier in the day. The priests continued their chant. The attendants bowed their heads, and somewhere, perhaps far away or perhaps very near, the soul of Mary Tudor finally found rest. Yet outside this moment of solemnity, the kingdom continued to shift. Elizabeth prepared to step into the role Mary had carried with such agony. Crowds gathered in the streets to greet a new era, and already the stories that would define Mary's legacy began to form distorted, simplified, sharpened into weapons of memory. But here, in this hall, strangers to history gathered quietly not to judge Mary, not to condemn or canonize, but simply to stand with her in the hours before she was taken to Westminster. A queen had died, a woman had suffered, and for one brief, flickering moment, the world paused long enough to mourn both. By the time dawn returned, pale and watery through the high windows of the great hall. The rhythm of Mary's final rites had settled into something steady and hypnotic, an undercurrent of murmured Latin, the soft crackle of candles, the distant groan of the palace adjusting to the weight of a new reign. The hall felt colder now, as though the long night had drawn heat from the air and memory from the stones. Yet Mary remained where she had been placed, her coffin surrounded by wavering gold light, her presence held together by ritual even as the world beyond the palace walls began transforming her into a legend she would never have recognized. And while her lying in state continued with the dignity granted to her rank, something more subtle and heartbreaking unfolded around her, the quiet reorganization of a life into a story, and the beginning of the long erasure that would soon make her more symbol than person. Outside the hall, the palace grew louder with each passing hour. Courtiers moved through the corridors with a renewed sense of purpose, their dark mourning clothes rustling like restless wings. Some whispered about Elizabeth's likely policies, already speculating about appointments, patronage, and favor. Others spoke in hushed tones of Mary's reign, reducing 5 difficult years into sharp summaries shaped more by bias than by understanding. A few loyalists attempted to quiet such harshness, but their voices were drowned beneath the swell of anticipation for the new queen. The shift was almost dizzying. Even though Mary's coffin still lay in the heart of the palace, her influence had already been swept aside by the winds of political necessity. In the quiet spaces beside the hall, tailors and seamstresses worked through the morning to prepare the final funeral banners. Though Mary had governed with a fierce devotion to Catholic tradition, many of these artisans were unsure which symbols to include. Should they craft images in keeping with Catholic ritual, or should they anticipate Elizabeth's reforms and adopt a more neutral iconography? The indecision mirrored the uncertainty of the entire kingdom. Even in death, Mary's identity remained contested ground, a battleground of faiths, a question mark hovering over the realm she had tried desperately to shape. Within the hall, however, the tone was different. The priests continued their chants, pacing slowly around the bier as they recited prayers meant to guide Mary's soul through the passage from earthly suffering to eternal judgment. Their voices rose and fell in long, mournful cadences that seemed to vibrate through the air like distant thunder. A faint smell of incense drifted through the space, mingling with the wax and the cold, creating an atmosphere both sacred and fragile. The priests did not rush. They lingered over every syllable. It was perhaps the only place in the palace where time still honored her, where the world had not yet overturned the memory of the queen who lay so still at the room's center. As the morning deepened, the hall received a small procession of servants, men and women who had once tended Mary's table, brushed her hair, helped her dress, carried her letters, warmed her bedchamber. They approached in hesitant steps, their eyes downcast, their grief quiet but unmistakable. Some knelt at the foot of the coffin, whispering private farewells that would never appear in any chronicle. One elderly man who had served Mary since she was a child reached out and laid his hand gently on the wood, his fingers trembling with age and sorrow. He remembered her as the young princess who had clung to her mother's skirts, as the girl who had been unjustly stripped of her title, as the hopeful woman who had fought for her right to reign. To him, she was not the figure of division the world would soon paint her as. She was simply Mary wounded, determined, devout, and tragically alone. By midday, the preparations for transporting her body to Westminster Abbey were underway. The coffin was lifted once more by the guards, each movement deliberate, each step echoing through the hall like a drum beat. Black cloth banners were unfurled along the route through the palace, fluttering slightly in the drafts, catching the candlelight in folds of shadow. The attendants who followed the coffin walked with a heavy solemnity, their footsteps blending into a single, steady cadence that filled the corridor with an almost ceremonial gravity. And yet, even as this procession moved toward the doors that would take Mary to her final resting place, the palace seemed eager to push her memory aside. Courtiers lined the hallway, not in mourning, but in observation watching, calculating, already thinking of how best to present themselves to Elizabeth. Their bows were shallow, their expressions unreadable. These were not gestures of homage to a departed queen. They were performances, carefully measured, for the benefit of those who would shape the future. Even in death, Mary could not command devotion from those who had never given it freely. When the coffin reached the courtyard, a faint winter wind lifted the hems of the attendants' cloaks, carrying with it the first distant sounds of a waiting crowd. Not a large one, nothing like the throngs that had once celebrated her triumphal entry into London when she reclaimed her crown, but a quiet gathering of townspeople who had come to witness the Queen's passage. Their faces were somber, their breaths fogging in the cold as they watched the guards maneuver the coffin onto the waiting bier. Some murmured prayers, others simply stood in silence, unsure whether they should grieve, relieved that a difficult reign had ended, or curious about the spectacle of royal death. But a few among them, mostly older women wrapped in heavy shawls, bowed their heads with genuine sorrow. They remembered Mary not as a monarch shaped by political decisions, but as a woman who had suffered publicly and privately, who had tried to restore her mother's honor, who had believed deeply in the faith she upheld. As the procession set off toward Westminster, the palace behind them seemed to exhale once more, shedding Mary's memory like a husk. Inside, servants were already instructed to begin clearing her chambers, removing personal items, preparing the rooms for their inevitable reassignment. Her portrait would soon be taken down, her mottos removed, her colors replaced by Elizabeth's. It was not cruelty. It was simply the nature of monarchy. The living displaced the dead, and power erased all traces of weakness. Yet in the slow rhythm of hooves and wheels, in the murmured prayers drifting through the cold morning air, Mary's true story lingered quietly. She was no longer the queen struggling beneath the weight of illness, nor the ruler trapped in the impossible battle between personal faith and political reality. She was simply a woman being carried toward her final peace, wrapped in linen, carried by hands that remembered her humanity even when the world had chosen to forget it. And as the procession crossed the threshold of the palace, leaving behind the place where she had suffered so much and received so little, Mary Tudor's long, lonely passage into history truly began. Not as the monstrous figure later imagined, nor as the triumphant sovereign she once hoped to be, but as a profoundly human soul whose pain echoed long after the candles around her coffin burned low.